This photograph of Ernest Hemingway was taken by the world-famous photographer Karsh of Ottawa. In Karsh's day, you were nobody if Karsh didn't photograph you. For most of his life, Hemingway was somebody. He was successful from quite an early age, and he seemed to spend his life cultivating the tough and handsome image captured so well by Karsh. However, the photograph also reveals the vulnerability of a poet. Ernest Hemingway was born on 21st July 1899 in Oak Park, a western suburb of Chicago. The house was number 439 Oak Park Avenue, a handsome house with turrets and verandas in a stable, well-to-do part of town. The house actually belonged to his widowed maternal grandfather, Ernest Hall. Hall's daughter, Grace, had married Dr. Edward Hemingway, a neighbor from across the road, a few years before, and they had settled with her father. A family group taken in 1906 shows the young Ernest with his mother and father, his older sister Marceline, and his two younger sisters, Ursula and Sunny. A much younger brother, Lester, arrived when Ernest was 16. Grace Hall, his mother, was a fine musician with a good contralto voice, good enough for her to debut in Madison Square Garden, New York. She had first aspired to a career in opera, but opted for a family life and a musical career in her hometown, teaching music and directing a choir, which appears to have earned her a good income. She was certainly a modern woman of her times. Freed from domestic chores by servants and nurses, she could develop her own interests in religion and music, and she made certain her children shared them. She designed this house in 1906 with a music room for herself and a consulting room for her successful doctor husband. It follows the style of a neighbor and friend, the world-famous architect Frank Lloyd Wright, who had built his own remarkable house only a few hundred yards away, recognized today as one of the landmarks of modern domestic architecture. The Hemingway house underlines the strong, driving character the mother had, awake to all the influences of her time. She most certainly was a considerable force in her family. Dr. Hemingway, although a stern and serious man, did have a good relationship with his son, and it seems to have been founded on his considerable abilities in hunting and fishing. For the first 17 summers of Ernest's life, the family holidayed at Walloon Lake in northern Michigan, and it was here, in idyllic country surroundings, that Ernest developed his taste for hunting and fishing. Apparently Dr. Edward did the cooking, another emancipated move by Grace behind this, no doubt. Here he bangs the dinner gong. There are many photographs of the family life which Ernest Hemingway enjoyed. His mother kept voluminous scrapbooks and photograph albums, so we know a lot about Hemingway's early days. They went by car to Walloon Lake for the first time. They all enjoyed swimming in the lake, and of course Ernest's first tastes of rod and gun are well documented. Education for Hemingway meant the neighborhood Oak Park High School. He apparently enjoyed school, and as it was a community showpiece, it offered as good an education as could be had. He was not good at games, but took up boxing at 14, where he at least showed he was brave. His first attempts at writing graced the school magazine, the Tabula. The Hemingway family, although enjoying all the comforts of life in the house in Kenilworth Avenue, was not without tensions, beginning early in Ernest's teens. His mother spent too much money, and the topic was the basis of a major break in the parents' relations. However it was smoothed over on the surface, the rift certainly colored the life of the children. things didn't improve, and by 1928, Dr. Hemingway's affairs were in ruins, along with those of many others at the time, it should be said, and he shot himself. Suicide was to be the path of Ernest Hemingway's sister Ursula, his brother Lester, and of Hemingway himself. Although Ernest always declared he had a happy childhood, the problems in the family were undoubtedly considerable and must have taken their toll on him in some way. In spite of the advice of his father and his grandfather Hemingway, both graduates of prestigious Oberlin College, Ernest refused to go to university. Aged 18, he went instead to Kansas, seeking a job as a newspaper reporter. Kansas was a flourishing town, crude and exhilarating by comparison with staid Oak Park. It was already famous for its jazz clubs, and its leading paper, The Star, was unique in its emphasis on the quality of writing demanded of the reporters. Hemingway's uncle knew the chief editorial writer, and Ernest began a stay of only 7 months as a cub reporter. Even in so short a time, he picked up ideas of style from the paper, a style terse, clear, looking always for extra meaning in the development of character or situation, driven always by action. These were to become the hallmarks of his work. It was 1918, however. The Great War in Europe still raged, and the United States had finally joined in the year before. Although declared unfit because of poor eyesight, Hemingway, along with another young reporter on the newspaper, who had already been driving ambulances on the war front in Italy, set off for Europe. He was given a commission in New York. By June, he was in Italy, driving ambulances for the Italian army at a camp just east of Lake Garda, north of Milan. He volunteered to operate an emergency canteen in the trenches along the Piave River. He was exposed to considerable danger. Near midnight on July 8th, he was seriously wounded. A shell landed about 3 feet away, killing the soldier nearest to him. In spite of a leg riddled with shrapnel, he picked up one of the wounded soldiers nearby and took him back to the nearest dugout. For this act of bravery, he was awarded 2 medals by the Italians, including the Silver Medal of Valor. He was taken to hospital in Milan, where 227 pieces of metal were removed from his leg. He made a great military friend, a British military officer, Chuck Dorman Smith. For years to come, though Dorman Smith was a professional soldier, they contrived to meet and shared travels and numerous adventures. The wounds and the bravery were the first part of this experience. Convalescence and Agnes von Kurowski was the second part. In a huge old mansion near the cathedral in Milan, he encountered a tall, beautiful, and lively nurse with whom he fell passionately in love. She was an American from Philadelphia, and though 6 years older than Hemingway, she seems to have fallen to his considerable charms. According to Hemingway, though disputed later by her, she often came to spend the night in his room. As he gradually recovered, they visited the sights of the city, went to the opera, and even the races. She was transferred to Florence later in the year, but their affair continued by letter. Hemingway returned to the States in January 1919, and it was agreed he would get a job and they would marry. Here he is at a welcome home party in his mother's music room. He had hardly settled down, however, when a letter came to tell him that it was all over between them, and that she was in love with an Italian colonel. Hemingway was devastated. It was no comfort to learn that the colonel in turn jilted Agnes. This vital episode of war and romance was to be the basis of his second major novel, Farewell to Arms, and was the first great reworking of his own remarkable experiences into an equally remarkable work of art. After some time as a journalist on the Toronto Star in Canada, a relationship that was to last for some time, Hemingway was back in Chicago writing for a monthly called the Cooperative Commonwealth. At a party in September 1921, he met Hadley Richardson. 6 years older than Hemingway, she had studied desultorily to be a concert pianist, but after an uncertain adolescence, coloured perhaps by her father's suicide, she never quite got to grips with her life. When she met Hemingway, she was beautiful, vivacious, and creative, and she seemed to be the girl he wanted to marry. She was certainly bowled over by her heroic boxing, shooting, hunting, and fishing, and literary hero. Hadley was from a well-to-do family in St. Louis, had had a privileged education, even attending Bryn Mawr College for a year, so in terms of class and expectations they fitted each other. They honeymooned at Windermere Cottage at Walloon Lake, Hemingway's childhood holiday home, then settled into a third-floor flat in a poor section of Chicago. Their dream was to go to Italy, where they might live cheaply on Hadley's small income. Hemingway had a friend in the Chicago writer Sherwood Anderson, a middle-aged man who suddenly left a successful career running a paint factory to write a novel, Winnisburg, Ohio, which won immediate acclaim. Anderson told them they had to go to Paris, the intellectual center of Europe. He gave them letters of introduction, and off they went. They started living in 74 Rue Cardinal Lemoine. Their flat was above an all-night dance hall. It was rough. Ernest got himself set up as the European reporter of the Toronto Star, however, and though the salary was a meager $1,500 per year, it helped them through these years when he began to write his first stories, all rejected. More important than his job and their day-to-day existence in Paris was the circle of friends they immediately made through the introductions of Sherwood Anderson. If there was a centre to expatriate artistic life in Paris at the time, it was the bookshop known as Shakespeare and Company. First in the Rue du Piton, then in the Rue de l'Odéon, it was run by an unusually liberated American woman called Sylvia Beach. The shop sold English books and ran a very free and easy lending library, important to the impecunious Hemingway. Sylvia Beach's function in the literary world was extremely crucial. She introduced English writing to the French, encouraged the writers, and even acted as a publisher for their work. Another of Sherwood Anderson's introductions was to Gertrude Stein, a highly educated and sophisticated American woman who encouraged Hemingway and introduced him to the contemporary art world. Stein invited many artists and writers to her apartment, where she was gradually building up a collection of paintings by artists such as Picasso, Matisse, and Cézanne. Picasso did a remarkable portrait of Gertrude Stein, and it is her collection and her salon, and although she was not a very rich woman, her encouragement of the artists of her time, that are her chief claim to fame. Ezra Pound, the American poet, was also in Paris. To him, Hemingway owed a special debt of gratitude. Pound made detailed critiques of Hemingway's writings, as well as helping to get his first work published in magazines and journals. Pound was already known for his tireless promotion of writers, notably the poet T.S. Eliot. His efforts for Hemingway were rewarded when Hemingway taught him to box. Another writer encountered by Hemingway in Paris was the Irish writer James Joyce. He too frequented Sylvia Beach's bookshop, and indeed his masterpiece Ulysses came to be published by her when it had been turned down by everyone else. Tall and thin, Joyce had very bad eyesight, but loved to dance and sing, and of course talk. The talk very often degenerated into wild insults when Joyce did not agree with his opponents. When things were getting really rough, Joyce would suddenly leave. Hemingway often found himself having to placate those most insulted. Joyce also loved to drink, and he and Hemingway had many notable sessions, with Hemingway supporting the excitable Irishman home. Although they had quite different styles and attitudes to writing, they seemed to have respected each other and remained friends until Joyce's death. Yet another notable friend was Scott Fitzgerald. Although they certainly enjoyed each other's company in literary terms, there seems always to have been some strain in their relationship. They did have a common interest in boxing. Still, Fitzgerald wrote warmly of Hemingway to his editor at the publisher Scribner's in New York. Fitzgerald had already had great success with 3 novels, including The Great Gatsby, so his opinion counted. Scribner's went ahead and published Hemingway's novels The Torrents of Spring and The Sun Also Rises in 1926. It was a great moment for Hemingway, though he finally fell out with Fitzgerald in a terrible argument in 1929, and their friendship was never really renewed. In the summer of 1923, a new dimension was added to Hemingway's interests. He went to Spain and saw his first bullfight. It was the beginning of a lifetime interest. In the atmosphere and the cruelty of the bullring, he found an enduring fascination. He followed the matadors from ring to ring, stayed in their hotels, learned all the details of the craft, and became completely engrossed. In 1923, the first Hemingway child was born, not in Paris, but in Canada, where they went to have the baby. Bumby was the nickname for the little boy, John. By 1924, they were back in Paris, Hemingway having broken his agreement with the Toronto Star. They struggled to live on Hadley's $50 a week. It was the period of their greatest poverty. For a time they even found it better to sublet their Paris apartment and go to ski in Austria, where it was even cheaper to live. When success came, part of the reward was to be taken up by Sarah and Gerald Murphy, rich Americans with an eye for the avant-garde in art and the money to bring them together. It should be said that Gerald was a gifted painter, and he at once threaded himself happily into the currents of abstraction. The Murphys had a house on the Riviera where they entertained everyone, it seemed, in the forefront of art in their times, from Picasso to Stravinsky. The Hemingways were there fatally in 1928, when their marriage was beginning to break up, and Ernest was embarked on an affair with Pauline Pfeiffer. They had met in 1925 at a party in Paris. She was the daughter of a rich American from Arkansas. Pauline had arrived in Paris with her sister Virginia. She was not especially pretty, but she was slim, boyish, with bobbed hair. She had great vivacity and the money to indulge her taste in the current flapper styles. She was, moreover, a fashion reporter for Vogue, and Ernest found her very attractive. Soon Pauline began to feel that only she could nurture the talent of Hemingway. Certainly her wealth would help, and her flattery, where others were more objective, must have played a part in the development of their relationship. It turned into a ménage à trois for a time, which Ernest enjoyed, but Hadley couldn't take. They amazed their friends by announcing their separation at the Murphys' house in Antibes. Married to Pauline Pfeiffer in May 1927, Pauline determined to do all she could to support him. She set up a beautiful apartment in Paris for them in a little street close to his beloved Luxembourg Gardens. The security she gave was good for his work. Hemingway was now rich enough to keep up with the Murphys and live the life of the celebrated novelist, which, with the success of The Sun Also Rises, he was becoming. He was for a time very happy with Pauline. They had 2 children, Patrick and Gregory. In 1928, Hemingway began A Farewell to Arms. It was to be one of his greatest successes, and it was written through a time of some personal distress. His second son, Patrick, was born by caesarean section, which was dangerous for Pauline. They traveled back and forth to the States in an effort to set up a new home in Key West. His father committed suicide that year, and the crash hit Wall Street. However, Farewell to Arms came out in 1929 and was an immediate and lasting success. Whether or not his happiness with Pauline contributed to this, Hemingway was certainly now made as a writer. He was almost 30 years old. Key West is the southernmost island in the chain stretching from the tip of Florida into the Caribbean Sea. It was an attractive backwater in 1928. It could be reached only by ferry. There was little work for most of the poverty-stricken locals, but it was full of character, offered the pleasures of deep-sea fishing on the doorstep, and finally, in 1931, a large old Spanish-style mansion which Pauline's uncle bought for them. The house was soon delightfully restored and became a wonderful base for the writer and his family. Here he established a steady routine of writing each morning in the study above the coach house. He produced here a stream of minor works, ending with the novel For Whom the Bell Tolls in 1940. It is not hard to appreciate that the home in Key West gave him just the right quality of life for his writing. It was not all work. In Key West he learned the art of deep-sea fishing from a certain Captain Bruh Saunders. Afternoons were given over to this activity, which he entered into with as much enthusiasm as his bullfighting. His friends in his fishing exploits, apart from Captain Saunders, ranged from a rich local socialite, Charles Thompson, to Joe Rissell, a one-time smuggler who owned the local bar, Sloppy Joe's. Sloppy Joe's was the place for evening entertainment, where yarns were swapped about the day's fishing or other folks' sea tales of long ago. Certainly from here came the atmosphere and realism of the later books set in the Caribbean. In 1934, Ernest had a boat specially built for him. Called the Pilar, it was 38 feet long, and with a cruising range of 500 miles and 6 berths, it made him independent and able to pursue his sporting pleasures to an almost unlimited degree. His experience as skipper of the Pilar was to be invaluable in his writing of such books as To Have and Have Not, as well as, of course, The Old Man of the Sea. He also used the boat for working on, and as time passed, a base for the extramarital adventures that began to develop as his marriage to Pauline weakened. Also on the Pilar, he became an expert on deep-sea fishing. As with everything he took up, it was an obsession with him. Struggling against the might of a huge fish, learning its ways and how to defeat it, this was his style, and for him, his triumph. In 1933, he and Pauline, financed by her uncle Gus, went to Africa on an extended safari, which lasted for over a year. Their guide was an Englishman called Philip Percival, and Hemingway, as always, was full of admiration for someone so expert in his field. Out of the trip came a non-fiction work called The Green Hills of Africa, in which he expressed his hunger for the extraordinary people and countryside of the continent. Out of the African trip also came 2 excellent short novels, The Snows of Kilimanjaro and The Short Happy Life of Francis Macomber. Ernest had already moved on to the international stage. He became friends with Marlene Dietrich on a transatlantic crossing in 1934. They both declared their passionate love for the other, though it seems they never had an affair. Other women came and went as his marriage to Pauline palled, ending in divorce in 1940. Martha Gellhorn, a journalist, turned up in Sloppy Joe's one evening in 1936. She was to be a more lasting liaison. Perhaps as part of his need for excitement and adventure, he followed her to Europe, where she was a correspondent for Vogue and a St. Louis newspaper. They met again in Spain, where Ernest became deeply involved with the Civil War and the mighty issues it raised. His experiences there were to form the basis for another successful war novel, For Whom the Bell Tolls. Like Orwell, the English writer who was there fighting against the fascist regime, he could not tolerate the totalitarian attitudes of the left wing, which were just as disturbing as the fascists. In his book, as always, he found that the people he wrote about were of greater significance than the issues of the war, a view certainly shared by his readers. With Martha, he made a remarkable journey across China, where she'd been sent as a war correspondent, and finally he set up house with her in the Finca Vigia, a large house near Havana, Cuba. It was an ideal escape from the public intrusion which was beginning to encroach heavily on his life, especially when his books began to be filmed by Hollywood. He did not remain with Martha, however. She was an ambitious and it seems a rather clinical person. After a few years, Ernest had met another reporter, Mary Walsh. He spent 2 months courting her in Paris shortly after the liberation, then flew back to Havana, where she joined him. Mary was to become his fourth and final wife. Theirs was a long and happy relationship. In 1954, the Swedish Academy awarded Hemingway the Nobel Prize for Literature. This arose principally out of his short novel, The Old Man and the Sea. This book had captured the imagination of the world and still figures as perhaps his most remarkable work. He didn't go to get the prize himself. He was extremely shy and hardly ever appeared in public. He felt greatly honored, however. In May 1959, having been forced to leave Havana by Castro, Hemingway bought a house at Ketchum, Idaho, where he was to spend the last 2 years of his life. By this time he was suffering from considerable personality problems. He made life difficult for those around him, including Mary, and he spent months as a psychiatric patient in hospital. His condition deteriorated, and on July 2, 1961, he shot himself. It was a sad end for someone who had been so warmly addicted to life himself, and who had, through his writing, brought so much pleasure and recognition of many of life's greatest values to his multitude of readers.